Okay, calm down.
Now, fast forward to this moment. Not only is all of this historical, elision evident and complicating the story, but we have more complication deliberately now when analysts are repeating the mantra that this attack on Israel, the October 7th attack, is the most significant attack on Jews since the Holocaust.
Yeah.
How irresponsible for to draw a through line between Nazi genocide, which racialized a Jewish people and targeted them systematically in order to achieve Aryan racial purity and German, glory once again, right? Make Germany great again,
right,
after their defeat in the First
right.
World War, to the attack which targeted Israelis, right? Which targeted Israeli nationals. It did not target Jews across the world. It did not target them based on a supremacist logic. And in fact, what we're seeing now, we haven't even been able to have this conversation because it's been so sensationalized, right? That we can't even have a conversation. What happened on October 7th, and what's being revealed, number one, a tremendous amount, right? A tremendous amount, including the fact that there were 1,200, not 1,400 people killed, that nearly 350 of them are combatants or soldiers who should be distinguished from civilians,
Right.
that Israeli Apache helicopters actually targeted the Israelis and Kibbutz Ma'ari, not Hamas, that 200, that the images of those who are being burned are
The burnt
actually
bodies, right?
burnt bodies of Hamas militants, that Hamas didn't know about the rave. They weren't targeting the rave. They didn't know about the rave, and that was crossfire and a lot of Israeli gunfire that killed the ravers. I'm not saying any of this to excuse or absolve, what happened. I say this because the fact that we're on day 46 and can't talk about this openly has to do with a hysteria that wants to give Israel the green light to basically use unrestricted violence and cruelty against Palestinians in order to annihilate them. And that's why this conversation is so important. And yet we haven't been able to have it. We can't even talk about who Hamas is.
Right.
Right? We can't even, they have a history. They exist. They don't come into, existence until 1987. That's what 30 years after the establishment, nearly 33 decades after the establishment of Israel. They are formed in response to ongoing occupation. Israel first tries to occupy the Gaza Strip in 56 before it occupies it in 67, right? Before the, and we can talk, about self-defense and so on and so forth.
Right.
And then the tactic, and they form also an opposition to Fatah and to the PLO, which is about to enter also into the peace process, where we see them relinquish, both rescind the resolution that Zionism is a form of racism. We
Right.
see also the rescindment of the right to use force, which is not, they're basically capitulating everything that they should have kept even as part of their negotiating leverage. And all the PLO got was recognition by the settler sovereign. And I'm not saying this to absolve Hamas in any way, but this history matters. Otherwise, they
Right.
float around like a boogeyman that are basically looking, to hurt and abuse Jews anywhere in the world.
Right.
Right?
And it becomes
It's like,
about hatred of Jews as opposed to the state of Israel.
and even this constant reference to their charter, the fact that
Right.
they amend their charter in
No one
2017.
knows
They make
that.
that
Yeah.
very explicit. I have to keep repeating, I'm not defending, but this matters
Right.
because we have to understand them as actually a political actor. They're
Right,
not
and this
just.
conflation of them with ISIS, which is so inaccurate, but also matters because the characterization of an organization will dictate what you should be expecting to happen. In other words, the idea that you can't negotiate with Hamas because they're like ISIS, they're saying that, right? Because they don't actually care about the captives. Like Israel and the United States don't care about the captives. They're making it seem like Hamas is like ISIS, that you can't
Mm,
negotiate with them,
mm.
um, because they don't actually want that to happen. They want to allow for the ethnic cleansing that's happening.
Hamas is a political actor. I mean, the fact that Hamas actually is influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. They were a resistance movement and then run for elections because of their influence by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And actually, that's the kernel of their establishment. And then enter into formal politics when they win parliamentary elections in 2006. They're never given the mandate to govern and then to
Right.
fail. I think they would have failed. Palestinians would have
Mhm.
voted them out. But when they won as a referendum against the peace process, which was very obviously a sovereignty trap that was used as a liberal veneer to allow Israel to take more Palestinian lands under a framework of peacemaking, and against Fatah, which becomes or the Fatah dominated Palestinian Authority, which becomes part and parcel of the occupation regime, right? These are political decisions that they make when they leave Syria in the midst of the Syrian uprising and then they relocate to Doha, Qatar. They're making a political decision that they will not survive in the midst of they couldn't side with the Assad regime and they couldn't side with the uprising. It was a lose-lose situation for them, so they relocate. This is a political decision. I mean, and then then talk about the fact that it Hamas has actually been one of Israel's partners, one of
Right.
Israel's partners in maintaining more quiet than we think about. There hasn't been rockets, there hasn't been anything from Gaza except for intermittently, right? Because Hamas actually rooted out ISIS when it established itself in the
Right.
Gaza Strip, and has authority over its adversaries that might want to use more force. And Hamas and Israel have established an equilibrium, and they have engaged in negotiations multiple times that were mediated by Egypt and Qatar. Now it's also mediated by Egypt and Qatar, which gets us to the point where immediately they were negotiating for the release of their hostages, right? Palestinian prisoners.
Right.
And the same deal that we see now on the table is the deal that has been on the table since before the ground invasion began, as well as since before the invasion of Al Shifa Hospital. Why is it that we haven't seen Israel take up, opportunities to release the hostages? Well, twofold. Number one, as you pointed out, that they're they'd rather kill
Right.
Israel as part of what's known as the Hannibal Doctrine,
Yeah.
and the response to the experience of the captured soldier Gilad Shalit, right? Kill your hostages before you have to negotiate again, right? And so we've seen this on full display. That's why we see a tremendous amount of conflict by the families of Israeli of the hostage, civilian hostages, by the Israelis who are opposed, right, to the government. They can release all the hostages.
Right.
Hamas
And they
has made it clear they will negotiate their whole release. They've released 4 without any precondition.
without anything in return. Yeah. For humanitarian
Absolutely
reasons.
not.
Right.
And have said multiple times, we'll release 50 women and the children. We want just stop the bombardment for
Right.
5 days, because Hamas doesn't even know where all the hostages are, because they've actually been taken by other factions. So they actually they need time to locate them. They've told us this over and over, right? So they haven't negotiated because one is not to negotiate at all. Two, because this is extending the shelf life of Netanyahu's political career,
Right.
which is absolutely over once this is over. Netanyahu is blamed for the October 7th attacks, the fact that there was no security at the time. There was the fact that he had actually emboldened Hamas in his bid to undermine the possibility of the establishment of a Palestinian state. for Netanyahu, extending this genocide is an extension of his political life, right? That's
Right.
two. And the third is that this is providing what the leaked document from the minister, that it was a think tank, but it was also had relationships to the Ministry of Interior, that basically said this is, quote, a rare and unique opportunity
Right.
to
That won't come
complete
again. Yeah.
the Sinai Plan, or the evacuation of Palestinians in Gaza to the Sinai,
Right.
right? Katie, I'm listening to myself talking to you, and all of this almost sounds, conspiratorial,
Right.
not for any other reason except for the fact that we have literally had no space to actually have a discussion about these things. We have not been able to examine Israel critically. We have not been able to examine Zionism. We've not been able to examine the crisis of a lack of accountability that has led us to this moment. What did people think was going to happen? I understand that people are shocked, but how are people
Yeah.
surprised that a refugee population that has been under 70 exiled for 75 years, under occupation for 56 years, and subject to a debilitating siege for 17 years, were children who were born in 2006, what they're now, my math is so awful, 13 years old, 17 years old, that those children who are 17 years old have lived through 5 major aerial and ground offensives, not all of them ground, but all aerial offensives, and a debilitating siege. What did they think these young people were going to do, as the rest of the world in this moment was negotiating the Abraham Accords
Right.
to actually normalize Israel's relationship with Arab regimes even further, and even after and everyone is applauding apartheid and normalizing it? What did they think was going to be the outcome of this? What do you think is the outcome of chronic racial colonialism? It breeds this kind of violence. It is violence. It is violence. And so the fact that we're not having that discussion, right? About, you've had an entire international human rights community, right? You've had UN ESQA come to the conclusion that this is apartheid. You've had
Right.
Human Rights Watch. You've had Yesh Deen. You've had B'Tselem. You've had Amnesty International. You've had the Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School all come to this conclusion. You've had these civilian tribunals like the Russell Tribunal, that was held in South Africa, come to this conclusion. You've had Al-Haq, and all these Palestinian organizations and Palestinian thinkers who have been forwarding this analysis for decades. We're suddenly going to make that all disappear and act like you're going to act like racist colonialism is just supposed to exist freely and with
Right.
acceptance in the world. I mean, I'm obviously very frustrated because I've been doing this work for a long time. You read my bio. I do a tremendous amount of scholarship on this work.
And
Yet here in this moment, there's a complete amnesia, as if they're talking to a Palestinian for the first time in their life. They've never seen a Palestinian. They don't know what we're talking about. And Hamas came out of nowhere.
right.
Right? There, and it's I'm really, really thirsty for an honest conversation. I'm really, really eager for a difficult conversation, one that actually gets us. There's fracture in the Palestinian community.
Right.
There's complexity there. We're not getting there even because
Yeah.
we're still at the surface level of trying to convince governments that genocide is not a legitimate form of warfare. You do not negotiate to end genocide. It is unequivocal. It doesn't come with conditions, right? It's not legitimate, period. This isn't like a legitimate war against Hamas, if that's what Israel wants to do, in which case we can discuss, conditions and disarmament and da 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 da
Right.
da. This is genocide, right?
Right.
And we're still here. We can't even have that conversation. Yeah, it's a really frustrating moment.
Lest anyone think you're being a conspiracy theorist, Brad, I think, has a newspaper headline to throw up. Netanyahu, money to Hamas, part of strategy to keep Palestinians divided. Um, That's from 2019, and then, of course, we'll link to it in the show notes, because there is that article that you talked about, that the blueprint from that think tank where they lay everything out.
Tariq Baoni's book on Hamas Contained is really wonderful. Khaled Hroub's book on Hamas
Yeah,
is something that we should read. If we're listing, I worked on a project in 2000 in the aftermath of the 2014 onslaught of Gaza, where we produced with a team at Jadaliya and Arab Studies Institute a bibliography of 110 entries, specifically thinking about Gaza in particular. This scholarship is ample
yeah,
on these issues, and everything that we're talking about in terms of Netanyahu's interests, the Hannibal Directive, um, even thinking about the if you I mean, we didn't talk as much about laws of war, which would have been really interesting. But in 2006, Israel establishes the Dahiya doctrine in
right,
its campaign against Lebanon, where it basically that we begin to see the formalization, right, of the transformation of civilians into legitimate
right.
targets in as far as Israel's laws of war are concerned,
And they're
right?
saying that's the one that says the goal is to respond with disproportionate force, right? That's the
Explicitly,
yeah,
explicitly. They say everything out loud,
right.
and then we get
Justify it
to
somehow.
mainstream Western media, which then starts to spin it, or to the White House, which then starts to spin it.
Right.
But Israelis are speaking incredibly
Yeah,
honestly, and
right.
have been.
And then Biden talks about the 40 babies, then he walks it back, and then he says it again.
And then he says it again, and then he says it again. I mean,
It's
I
insane.
but it's just an absolute. I mean, first of all, I think he's personally invested.
Yeah.
I mean,
He loves to say he's a
he's
Zionist.
contradicting his base. 80% of
Yeah,
Democrats want a ceasefire. A letter across 40 U.S. agencies of 500 signatories have opposed this. Congressional walkout of 1,000 staffers have opposed this. There's three State Department memos that have been leaked in opposition to Biden's policy. He's even contravening, his own ranks, and I
yeah,
think that it reflects a personal commitment in this moment that uh, isn't even even not even self-interested if you think
right,
about the upcoming elections and
right,
his the possibilities of his prevalence. I mean, this actually hurts the entire Democratic Party,
right.
period. The
Yeah.
entire Democratic Party that couldn't respond to its base. Whenever 80% of Democrats agreed on anything.